Welcome to the second of our three lectures on ancient Greece. We're going to continue where we left at the last end of the last lecture with the Greek defeat of the Persians. And following this lecture, there's a separate lecture on Greek philosophy, focusing on the major Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. So again, let's just look at the period now of classical Greece and the Hellenistic period. The classical starts with the defeat of the Persians in 479 BCE. You can think of it in round terms of around 500 BCE. I will never ask you a question on an exam such as what was the date that the Greeks defeated the Persians. Was it 480, 490, 468, or whatever? Just as long as you have the time frame, fine. That's fine. So we're going to go classical from around 500 BCE for about 200 years to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Now within this classical period, you have what's often known as the Golden Age. This is about a 50-year period from 450 to 404 BCE. And 404 BCE was when Sparta conquered Athens. You'll recall that the city-states or the polis were very independent. And at this point, the great military might of Sparta finally defeated Athens. But this golden age, this roughly 50-year period, is the peak of artistic and philosophical achievements in ancient Greece. We'll see in the next class, this is when we have Plato, Socrates, Aristotle in this time period. We also have, we'll see in a few minutes, some of the great architectural achievements such as the Parthenon. So after the classical period, we have what's called the Hellenistic period. This is from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE to 146, when the Roman Empire took over Greece, and it simply became part of the Roman Empire. Now let's look briefly at the essential beliefs in the classical period. This follows naturally from what we saw in the last lecture, the thought that reason and order could be achieved. Humans themselves had agency. They had the power to triumph over the chaos of the natural world, and they could create a balanced society. And the goal of life was perfect balance. Now, humans needed to know and understand the motives for their actions. Why are they taking certain actions? They have human agency, so they have the ability to control their actions. Now, at the same time, they still believe in the gods. They still have many gods. So they haven't just put the gods to the side, but they've said in certain areas the gods are not all powerful as in the past. And so you have both human action, human reason, and then you have the sphere of the gods. They're both of equal importance. As I mentioned in the last lecture, now we have belief in human agency, the capability and potential of humans to take actions themselves. And of course, those actions will have consequences. We're going to look at the Parthenon, the great architectural temple, and that was to honor the goddess Athena. And we'll see in a minute there was a beautiful statue over there, but also to honor Athens, the city of Athens, and the many human achievements of the city of Athens. Athens, of course, is the present-day political capital of Greece, but it was the political as well as cultural and intellectual center of Greece during the Golden Age. Sparta was flourishing, but more as a military power. After the defeat of the Persians in 479 BCE, Athens was the most powerful polis or city-state. And they set up a pure democracy. And this was part of their stability here for 50 or 60 years. It required all male Athenians were required to participate. There was no gender equality. Women could not vote. And slaves, male slaves, couldn't vote either. But all other Athenians could vote. And in fact, they were required to participate. And Pericles was the great leader from 461 to 429 BCE. And you can read a little more about Pericles in your textbook. Let's look quickly at the founding of Athens. According to Greek mythology, there were two competing gods who went to a hilltop and they wanted to found a new city. Poseidon, and you'll recall Poseidon is a god associated with the sea and the powers of the ocean. He took his Triton and he struck it into the ground, and a spring of water appeared. And he said, well, water is essential for any city. Well, Athena stomped her foot on the ground, and an olive tree miraculously appeared. Well, olives were so central to Greek life, and we saw that in the last lecture when I talked about the importance of olives as well as olive oil to the Greek culture, that the Athenians decided to make Athena and not Poseidon the patron god of Athens. Now this is obviously a modern day view of the Parthenon. That's the temple we see, the large temple we see there, on top of the Acropolis. The Acropolis is not the temple. The Acropolis means the top of the hill. And you can see in the background on the right there, and also on the left, but particularly on the right, a hill. There are many, many hills like that. It's a mountainous area. So they constructed the Acropolis by taking away the top of that hill. There had been a hill right here, just like the one in the background, making it flat for construction, for defensive purposes. Now, taking away the top of the hill is easier said than done. They didn't have explosives then. They didn't have bulldozers and dump trucks and everything else like we have today. So it was done by human labor. Largely slaves would cut off the top of the hill and make it flat like that and build up walls around it, as you see, so it doesn't fall down. Now this is a reconstruction of what the Acropolis, or the top of the hill, looked like in ancient Greece. You can see the large structure there in the upper part of the photo. That is the Parthenon, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And you can see at the time it was brightly painted, the figures. And it wasn't a temple in the sense of a modern day church or synagogue or a Muslim mosque where people would go inside to pray. Rather, only the very most senior priests were allowed to go in, and there was a large statue of the goddess of Athena. Other people on rare occasions were allowed to go in and make an offering at the steps. You can also see some other structures. There's one small structure there on the left we'll talk about in a minute, and that's the temple of the Greek goddess Nike. Again, here is the Parthenon. We briefly saw this in the first or second lecture when I talked about the issue of whether there should be a law to prohibit people from taking cultural artifacts from their country of origin or returning them. And you recall many of the sculptures that were in the inside of the wall of that building, above the columns. It's called the frieze. The wall are now in the British Museum. And there's also a video in the module talking about who owns those sculptures. And I think you'll enjoy that given our previous discussion. Now here we are, we're looking at the Parthenon. It's pretty badly destroyed. There's no roof. It's 2,000 years of weather. It was also many, many years after the end of the ancient Greek Empire. There was an army in there, and it had its ammunition supplies in there, and the enemy, in a lucky shot a cannonball in and exploded it and almost destroyed the whole building. It's sad to say, but the actual um, marble and limestone of the building has suffered more decay the last 50 or 60 years than in 2,000 years. And that's from pollution from cars and trucks in the large, busy city of Athens. You may have heard of acid rain. What happens is certain emissions from cars and trucks go up into the sky, and when it rains, they come down, and it's slightly acidic, and one or two rains doesn't really do anything. But after a number of years, it starts to literally eat away the stone. And for that reason, they try and gently wash off the structure on occasion. They can't use high pressure, will fall down. But this is happening in many places around the world. Well, not only ancient ruins, but modern buildings. And I know, of course, in the east coast of the United States, you probably know emissions from coal-fired power plants, electricity plants in the Midwest. The emissions, the winds carry them 1,000 miles, and it creates acid rain in other states. And it's a big, big issue now in many countries. Well, back to the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon was part of this classical age search for order I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. There was a 40-foot high statue of Athena, which unfortunately was destroyed or stolen for its gold. And ivory was considered very, very precious because ivory obviously comes from elephants, so that meant it had to be imported from Africa. And Athena was worshipped as a virgin god. And in fact, the building is called the Parthenon because the word virgin in Greek is Parthenon. You look at the building, at a glance, it just looks like vertical columns, horizontal lines, but they're not. And I encourage you to watch the video on the Parthenon, and it will show you how the columns actually sort of bulge out at the center and come in, and none of the lines are vertical or horizontal. That was done not because they couldn't construct a vertical column or a horizontal surface, but rather they had studied how the human eye perceives beauty, and they realized by putting these slight irregularities in, the human eye would perceive it as more structured and more perfect. The columns are Doric. We'll talk more about what Doric is. It's an architectural order in a minute. And what's really amazing, particularly to modern day architects, is the fact that the building was purposely designed to be earthquake resistant. That area, Greece, suffered then and continues to suffer from numerous earthquakes, and the Parthenon is built on bedrock. There's nothing to cushion it from the earthquakes. And in fact, in recent decades, there have been some major earthquakes in that part of Greece, and modern days buildings have fallen down, and the Parthenon just sort of shakes and hasn't fallen down. Now, the ancient Greeks purposely built in earthquake protection. They have three ways they did this, and I'll just go through this quickly. I think it's just amazing that they did this, and this shows the level of their architectural knowledge. The whole building is designed to be flexible, and of course this is the basis of constructing earthquake-resistant buildings today, whether they're in Japan or wherever. They're supposed to roll with the earthquake. When I lived in Mexico City, which unfortunately has quite a few earthquakes every year because it's built on an old lake bed, I remember the American Embassy is actually, like most modern buildings, like all modern buildings, it's built on rollers designed to move. And I am not exaggerating, my office on the top floor, sometimes I literally could not stand up during a 1 or 2 minute earthquake. It felt like I was on a rocking ship. Pictures and things would fall off the walls, And we were told, don't worry, the building is designed this way so it doesn't fall down. But still, it's quite concerning to be in a building when you stand up and it feels like a ship shaking from side to side. In the Parthenon, there is no mortar or cement used to hold anything together. That's amazing. The blocks, the columns are not held together by cement. They want the whole thing to wiggle a little during an earthquake. Let's look at the three elements. The first is the foundation. Now, the homes you and I live in right now, we have a foundation here in the Houston area. It's a thick slab piece of concrete with reinforced metal rods inside, rebar, and we don't suffer, I don't think ever, earthquakes here, or certainly many, and so that just moved by itself. If they had used something like that in ancient Greece, it would have just cracked. So what they have are multiple layers of thin marble placed on top of each other. They're not glued together or anything. So when the ground shakes or moves, these pieces of marble slide back and forth. Now let's look at the columns. When you look at the columns, you look at the photograph, you look at the video, they look like a single piece of marble that's been carved into a column. Now there are many columns like that, but not in Greece. When we look a little later in the course at Rome, we'll look at the famous Roman Pantheon in the city of Rome. Those are solid pieces of marble. These are not. These are drums, about 2 or 3 feet high, look like drums, stacked on top of each other with a wooden pole in the middle. This allows movement. So when the ground shakes, the elements of the column sort of move. Here's a slide showing, you can see the columns. Now when you look at the columns, they look beautiful. You can see in the beginning and the front of it, the drums. They have a hole in the middle, and they're lifted up and put down over a long wooden pole in the middle. And so they might move slightly during an earthquake, and then they're pushed back, but they don't. It allows a little flexibility. Here we have a drawing. Please don't blame the artist. I drew this. You now see why I don't teach art. We have the drum. We have the wooden pole in the middle. And the area I shaded in red is a slight space between the wooden pole and the marble drum. And with that slight space, it allows the drum to move back and forth a little bit. Otherwise, the whole column would come down. Now, the third element are the blocks. The construction blocks, which normally are connected with mortar or cement. In my house, they are at least. But they couldn't do that because they didn't want this rigidity. So they connected them with iron. Let me go to the next slide and explain this. Okay, here we have 2 blocks. And you can see, if you look at it in orange, in the very center, the iron bar. Looks a bit like a dog's bone in a cartoon, but that's an iron bar, and around it is lead. And it fits into a hole that's made in the blocks. So the blocks are put together, and there's a hole. The hole looks like sort of a cartoon of a dog bone. They put the piece of iron in there. Now they take lead, they melt the lead, and they pour the liquid hot lead all around to fill in the hole. Now the lead has 2 purposes. One purpose is it prevents the iron from rusting, because as you know, iron rusts. They hadn't developed steel yet in the world, so they had to use iron. But of importance for earthquakes is the lead, even though it's hardened, is much, much softer than the iron. So when the earthquake comes and it shakes the building and those stones move slightly, the iron bar has the flexibility to move slightly within that lead. It can move 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch and push the lead around. And what the lead does is the lead is absorbing the shock wave, or in physics, the kinetic energy, and the lead heats up. But that's okay, and that keeps it together. Okay, I mentioned the Parthenon has a Doric column, and here are the three main types. There are actually a few more types, but these are the three main types of what are called architectural order. And we look at this primarily in the columns. It also impacts other elements in the buildings, but we focus in this course on the columns. So on the left, we have the Doric. You can see the bottom of the column. There's no decoration. It just goes right into the foundation. At the top, it's rather simple, sort of a block. That's the Parthenon. The next one is called Ionic. It looks like a little scroll. And then the one on the far right is Corinthian. It has what look like flowers. Be sure and watch the video in the module, and also look at these three types in the textbook. There will be a textbook, a quiz or test question on one kind of a column. This is from a movie theater. I took this a few years ago on Highway 99. Just south of Katy, where I live. It's changed names. I think it's called the Regal Theaters now. But anyway, look at those columns. Look at the top. And what do you have at the top? That's an Ionic column. I guarantee you, after you watch the video, and as the video suggests, every time you see columns, whether they're in front of people's homes or whatever, you'll start to notice, oh, it's Ionic or whatever. I remember that from Professor Glover's house. Now you'll see many, many buildings in Washington, D.C., government buildings, or in Austin, or city halls, have Greek columns. Why? Because the architects want people to think that, oh, U.S. democracy, U.S. system of government has its roots in Greek democracy. And the Romans, will see, also use similar columns, because much of our legal system and whatnot, as we'll see soon, comes from Rome. Now, the sculpture in the Parthenon itself is really noted for its delicate and realistic drapery. Drapery, remember here, means not the drapes on the windows, but what they called the clothing, because people really didn't wear what we now call shirts and pants, or, it's not really a dress for women either. It's sort of like a tunic they wrap around themselves. So that's called drapery. And the sculpture is noted for how delicate it is and realistic. And it flows with the body underneath. And I put here in red, and this is very important, this is the first time in art that we know of in the world that there's such detail and anatomical precision. So many, many people look back to the ancient Greeks, and we'll see the Romans here. And near the end of the course, when we get to the Renaissance, which was largely in Italy, we'll see the Renaissance looking back to Greek and Roman art. And of course, the word Renaissance means rebirth. And the Renaissance in Europe was what? It was a rebirth, supposedly, of Greek and Roman civilization. So the focus now becomes on the pursuit of naturalism in art. This is an excellent example. This is from the Parthenon. No surprise, this is in the British Museum. Remember when we looked at the issue of returning artwork to its country of origin? Really, anything smaller than a temple has probably left Athens and moved to Paris, London, New York, or primarily those three cities, to the museums there. Much to the regret of the Greek people and the Greek government. But be that as may, these are the three goddesses. Their heads have been missing. But just look carefully at the clothing, the drapery. Look at the woman on the left. You can see her knees sort of clearly, and the cloth. This is done, of course, in rock, and this is in marble. How beautifully it's done. How it makes it look like it's flowing. At the same time as drapery, we have great, great realism in anatomy. They study the human form. You can look at this reclining man. You can look at the symmetry of the body. Both sides of the body are the same. You can look at his rib cage. You can see his arms. You can see his leg muscles. It becomes very detailed and very, very realistic. One of the small temples which is still there on the Acropolis, the top of the hill near the Pantheon, is the Temple of Athena Nike. And this, look quickly at the column. The top of the column is the easiest way. You can see what looks like a little scroll. It's an Ionic column. And you can look at the base too. There's a little decoration down there. Now this is Nike, the Athena's, she's one of the goddesses. Now if I say Nike, well, you think it probably is shoes. In my face-to-face classes, I often ask students how many are wearing Nike, and about 3/4 of the students raise their hands and stick their legs out to show me that they're wearing Nike. If I'm not, I have a pair in my closet. And of course, the Nike shoes have this looks like a check mark. Well, that is not a check mark. That is a symbol of the wings of the goddess Nike, because Nike was the goddess symbolizing speed and victory, and she was able to achieve speed because of wings. Now, the company Nike picked up the name, obviously, and the wing. Why? Because when you wear their Nike shoes, you will be fast and have victory. This is a famous sculpture of the goddess Nike stopping, leaning over to adjust her sandal. You look behind her, and you can, particularly on the right side, you can see the outline of her wings. Look at her drapery, her clothing. It's almost transparent. This is amazing. Can you see the outline of the leg under her clothing? Now, it's always surprised me that being a goddess who can fly, that she would have to wear sandals. Why would she walk? She can fly, and why would she have to adjust them? But anyway, now this is not a standard statue. You can't walk behind it, because behind it is a piece, it's glued onto a piece of stone. So it's called a relief structure. But it's just amazing to look at that detail. So again, now in the classical age, we're seeing naturalism, realism, a real striving for that. And the standard of human beauty is proportioned. The proportions right. The length of the arms, the legs relative to the size of the torso. Symmetry, both sides of the face are the same. And balance. And symmetry is very crucial for most humans' perception of beauty. In fact, a few years ago, I read a group of psychologists took portraits of people who had no obvious distortions in their face, and through Photoshop or some other program, they slightly changed the symmetry in the face. They moved, for instance, one eye just a bit further away from the center of the nose than the other eye, or the ear or something, that at a glance you couldn't notice it. And then they brought in a couple hundred volunteers and asked them to look at photos of people. And they found a significant difference between those who had symmetry in their face and those who had slight asymmetry or a slight distortion put in. And apparently the human eye and the brain has been conditioned for whatever, to look for that symmetry, which I guess our ancestors thought meant health. Same thing, proportion. I mean, most people, one leg is more or less the same length as the other, etc. And the focus now in art becomes the individual. In addition to getting the right proportion, symmetry, and balance for the body, they want to try and show emotions. We'll see more of this when we look at Rome. And they also want to try and show people in death and mourning, which are universal experiences. Here we have a very famous statue. Again, it's a statue because you can walk around it. It's three-dimensional, of a discus thrower done by Myron. Now, unfortunately, the original in bronze no longer exists because when Athens was conquered, the conquerors, in this case the Romans, melted down the beautiful bronze statue to make cannons. No, excuse me, not cannons, to make shield. They didn't have cannons yet. To make shields or swords or something with them. But some other artists had made marble copies of the beautiful bronze statue just to practice their techniques. This is still an Olympic event, throwing the discus, and many high schools, some of you may have done discus in high school. You take what looks like a frisbee, except it's very heavy, and I think you turn half a turn or a full turn and see how far you can throw it. In ancient Greece, you weren't allowed to turn your body around like now, but it's obviously a difficult event. Now, let's look closely at his body. Just look at first of all, you have a sense of movement. You see how one leg is in front of the other. The man's left leg, you look at his foot, the toes are just touching the ground. The weight is clearly on his right leg. Look at his right thigh, the statue. You can see the muscles rippling. Obviously, the man's in good shape. You can see, but they're ripped because he's got all the weight there. You can see in his right arm, which is up in the air with a discus. You can see the muscles rigid. You can see, actually, if you look closely, you can see artery, or I guess it's an artery or a vein, because that's such good shape. You can look at his face. He's concentrating. He's thinking exactly how he's going to twist and how he's going to throw it. This is very, very realistic. This is considered a masterpiece, even though it's a copy of the original. It's amazing to see here in a color photo, and I guarantee you it's much more amazing to stand there in person and look at it. As I mentioned, when Greece was conquered, the Romans melted down all the beautiful bronze statues to use for weapons. This is one of the few original Greek bronze statues found. It was only found because it was found in the ocean near Italy. And as you recall from the previous lecture, the Greeks controlled southern Italy for a number of years. During that period, this bronze statue was sent by ship from Greece to southern Italy. The ship apparently had problems in a storm, and the captain probably decided to lighten the ship by throwing these bronze statues overboard because they were quite heavy. And fortunately for us, some archaeologists found them. But you can see the detail, the great detail. You can see the muscles in the arm. You can see the hair. And again, there are only, I think, 5 or 6 of these that have been found. Move quickly to theater. For the ancient Greeks, the theater was considered a sacred area, and it was considered taking part in a religious ritual. They had plays there, they had comedies, they had music, and they also had recitation. Recitation is someone standing up and reciting from memory, maybe 30 minutes from a great Greek work, maybe the Iliad, the Odyssey is something else. And actually, in the United States and Europe until about 50 or 60 years ago, the poor kids had to spend much of their education memorizing long things to recite, and they might have to stand up and recite for 10 minutes, word for word, from a long poem or something. I don't think many of us had to do that, fortunately. Now, the audience, as it came in, people would buy nuts and raisins to snack on. Excuse me, allergies. But the audience was also allowed or encouraged to throw the nuts and raisins if they wanted to criticize the actors. actors. Or if they liked the actors, they could buy flowers as they went in and throw them. This is a particularly, to me, impressive picture of one of the large theaters that you could visit today. It seated, well, it still seats 12,000 people. You can see how huge it is, how huge it is. Now, the theater was carved out of a hillside. Remember I mentioned the hilly terrain there. You can see just in the background another hill. I mean, they could have built a theater there, cut out part of it. The advantage is they don't have to build anything to support the stadium or the theater. When you sit on the marble or stone bench, your weight just goes into the ground. We'll see in Rome, the Colosseum and whatnot, they're all freestanding. And behind the stage, there's a structure no longer existed that was 2 or 3 stories high, and with windows, and characters would pop their heads out and say or see things. The acoustics are so good that if you go there now with a tour guide, the tour guide will have you huff and puff and go up to the top of the theater, and then will speak in a normal volume, and you can understand every word. And acoustical engineers are just amazed at the way the sound bounces off and carries so well. Now, Alexander the Great was not from Greece itself. If you look at this map, Athens and Sparta down there in the southern part. He was from Macedonia in the north, but he grew up with a Greek tutor. His father very, very much admired the Greeks. He admired their culture, their language, so he spoke fluent Greece. And what happened was the Greek city-states started fighting among themselves, and Alexander had an army. He went in and took over. And as you can see in this map, what he wanted to do was extend the wonders of Greek culture eastward rather. So he went through modern day, you can see Anatolia is Turkey today, all the way through the Middle East, all the way right up to with modern day India and down into Egypt. This is called the Hellenistic period. And this lasted from, then he died in 323, and this influence continued through this whole area until Rome, about 150 years later, in 146 BCE, conquered the area and made it part of the Roman Empire. And when I mentioned the warfare among the city-states or the polis, we'll see the same thing when we get to the Italian Renaissance. We'll see this. There was no modern Italy then, and the polis or city-states were the center of political and cultural life. And we'll see Florence, Siena, Milan, Venice, Verona, etc. And then we'll see how they finally all started to fight each other, and that led to the end of that epic. So Hellenize, the verb Hellenize, means spread Greek influence. And that's what Alexander the Great did and subsequent rulers. And I've put in red again to emphasize that art became much more emotional, much more expressive, much more realistic. And common people were now included in art, not just, the nobility. And they tried their best to portray emotion, which is difficult to do in art. But we saw it there with the discus thrower rather, Myron's discus thrower. Remember his face, the intense concentration. When you look at that, you could just imagine that he's alive, and you watch the muscles tensing up, and he's really, really focusing on throwing that discus. Well, the Roman Empire, as I mentioned a few slides back, gradually conquered all of the Hellenistic kingdoms that flowed out from Alexander the Great and his successors. And then what you had is these whole areas were incorporated in the Roman Empire. But some of classical Greece and Hellenistic Greece culture survived, and it was fused with the native Roman culture to produce sort of the Greco-Roman Empire, a culture which we'll talk about later. Okay, this is the end of the second of 3 lectures on ancient Greece. The next lecture will look very briefly at Greek philosophy. Thank you.